I'm not sure. Do I need to use a microphone to be heard? Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me now? Okay. So we've got another minute or so before we start, but the Dodd Center folks wanted me to read this Conover Auditorium emergency announcement. So, welcome to where you are. Please note, in case of an emergency, in case of an emergency, the exits are right back here. In case of a water landing, little bags will drop down from the ceiling with snacks. Please, no smoking. Silence your cell phone. And thank you for your attention. I didn't read that right. All right, so for those of you who are not in my news writing class, my name is Mike Stanton. I'm a professor of journalism here at the University of Connecticut. And I'm thrilled to introduce Karen Crouse, who's a sports writer for the New York Times. Karen once wrote that she was the Forrest Gump of sports writers, a witness to all kinds of history. She was there for the Mighty Ducks' first NHL game, Pete Sampras's last major victory, the New York Football Giants' Super Bowl win over the Patriots, the Cubs' playoff loss to the Marlins when Steve Bartman grabbed the foul ball, which is probably before many of you were born. But that was when the Cubs were a cursed franchise like the Red Sox used to be. Karen, more recently, has covered, is it 10 Olympic Games?
11.
Or 11 Olympic Games, counting just returned from South Korea. She was happy to be greeted with winter-like weather here in stores when she arrived last night. And she's going to talk about storytelling, sports writing, her journey from her native California to Vermont, the subject of her book, Norwich, is really as unlikely maybe, or she gracefully phrases it in her book, it's like being an avocado tree among sugar maples. It's interesting how she was inspired to become a sports writer. I'm going to let you ask her about that if she doesn't bring it up herself. But I think it would have real relevance to you as student journalists, some of whom aspire to be sports writers as well. But I think what's really interesting, Karen was actually here at UConn, was it in the fall of 2015 when she was starting to write this book. And one of the key figures in it, Sunny Snight, who was an Olympic aspirant skier from this town of Norwich, actually came with her because she was interested in seeing the home of the UConn women's basketball team. This is a story of empowerment for women athletes at a time when they weren't really encouraged. And Sunny was someone who was hard for Karen to get to talk to. She finally did. And that's a gift that Karen has, getting people to talk, weaving their stories together, and going beyond the triumphs and tribulations of the daily event to get athletes to really open up to her. When she covered the New York Jets for the New York Times, you had a wide receiver named Lavernius Coles, who opened up to Karen on the beat about his sexual abuse as a child. And again, how she got him to do that is a great story that hopefully we'll hear today. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up Karen to talk, and she'll talk for a bit, and then I know you have questions to ask, and there's a lot of interesting things she can share with you. So thank you, Karen.
Thank you. All right, so I'm probably going to be going all over the place here in my talk, but I am going to start with my Mike Brunner story that Mike alluded to, because it explains why I love the Olympics so much, and that gets into how I came to write this book. And it also is one of my favorite stories. Everyone in this room has the power to change someone's life. And when I tell you this story, you'll see why I say that. So I grew up in Santa Clara, California, back in a time when no one knew where Santa Clara was. I remember going to college in LA, only 400 miles away, and when people asked where I was from and I said Santa Clara, their brows furrowed, like, where is that? Now, of course, thanks to the 49ers and Levi's Stadium, everyone knows where Santa Clara is. I was in Paris and someone said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Santa Clara," and they go, "Oh, 49ers." So there you go. But the one thing Santa Clara was known for in the 70s when I was growing up was swimming. It was the epicenter of swimming not only in the United States but in the whole world. So I grew up swimming for Santa Clara Swim Club and then a team called De Anza, and really wanted to be an Olympian. Three of my first four coaches were Olympians. I trained with Olympians, alongside Olympians, coached by people who coached Olympians. So it felt, this amazing feat actually felt very normalized. I knew so many people who had gone to the Olympics that it almost felt like, oh, of course I'll go. It's a rite of passage. So I was in 8th grade when it was 1976, right before the Olympic swimming trials, and my 8th grade English teacher assigned a project to write a magazine, create a magazine from scratch. So of course I was going to do a swimming magazine. And I got home and told my parents about this assignment, and my dad said, "Who are you going to interview for your main feature of this magazine?" And I said, "Oh, well, I'm just going to make up an interview." I don't know, like in many ways I might have been way ahead of the curve in journalism with my fake news sensibility, but my dad said, no, you need to interview Mike Brunner. So Mike Brunner, the best I can describe him, was the Michael Phelps of our day, of my day. He was a multi-event athlete. He was a butterflyer, a freestyler, an IMer. He was expected to make the 76 Olympic team in many events and get as many as 3 or 4 gold medals. And he was on my team, but I was 13 years old and he seemed inaccessible to me, and the idea of even talking to him was so mortifying to me. It made me tremble just to think about it. And so I told my dad, there is no way I can talk to Mike Brunner. I mean, all of us young kids looked upon him as if he was godlike. And my dad said, no, you've got to. This is the perfect story for you. So the next day we went, my dad took me to work out, and we talked to the head coach. His name was Bill Rose. And I explained that I had this assignment and I wanted to interview Mike. And Coach Rose said, all right, you stay after practice tomorrow and I'll make sure that Mike talks to you. So I found this out years later, but what Coach Rose did that day was say to Mike, you need to stay after practice tomorrow because you have an interview. So Mike, not unreasonably, thought, oh great, someone from the San Jose Mercury is going to talk to me, or the San Francisco Chronicle, or Sports Illustrated. You can imagine what must have been going through his mind when the next day he walks out after workout ready to do this big interview, and he sees this, pipsqueak little girl with pigtails holding 3x5 index cards in trembling hands. But he was so gracious. He answered all of my questions. If he was at all horrified to be talking to this non-professional journalist, he did not betray any signs of it. And so I got my interview, did the magazine, got an A on it. So my dad gave me a piece of advice that I've kept to this day. He said, anytime you talk to someone, you need to make sure that they see a copy of the final results. So you need to Xerox copies of this magazine and give one to Coach Rose and one to Mike. Well, as it turned out, my dad took me to the Olympic trials that year. They were in Long Beach, so just an hour plane ride from where we lived. And we arrived at the Olympic trials with my 2 copies of Splash in hand, right after Mike had had a pretty dismal start to his meet. He made the relay team in the 200 free. One of the events he was expected to make an individual event. So instead of vying for 2 gold medals, he was just a part of the relay team. And then he failed to make the 400 free team altogether. So at a time when he was expected to have been 3 for 3, he was 1 for 3. And the day we arrived, his best event was coming up. It was the 200 butterfly. So when I speak of this, I hope you appreciate the generosity of spirit that was involved on all levels of this experience. So I arrive at the meet, pressure-packed situation, hand Coach Rose the 2 copies of Splash, and in 30 years of covering these sports as a journalist, I honestly can't think of another coach I've dealt with who would have done what Coach Rose did when I handed him these magazines. He stopped what he was doing and took the time to read the interview with Mike. Every coach I know, and I know some lovely ones, would have, nodded, said thank you, and then the minute I turned around would have probably put the interview in the trash can. I mean, that's just the reality. They're busy people. But Coach Rose read the interview. He gets to a certain part and he goes, Karen, this is fantastic. I'm going to have Mike read this right away. And then he disappears. So I have no idea what's going on until years later when the story's fleshed out for me. What Coach Rose did was he went and found Mike and he made him read aloud a passage from the Q&A I had done with him. And the passage was something about, I had asked him, like, showing my insecurity for sure as a 13-year-old, like, what happens if you get to the big meet and you're not really feeling very good and you're not swimming really well? How do you still manage to swim fast? And Mike had said something to the effect of, well, the person with the strongest mental outlook is always going to be the one who wins, and I have complete confidence that I've worked harder than anyone else, so no matter how I'm feeling in the water, I believe that I will do well. So Coach Rose made Mike read that not once but twice out loud. So Mike goes out that night and he wins the 200 butterfly. And he's asked afterward by a Long Beach Press-Telegram reporter, so your meet got off to a bit of a rocky start. You turned it around tonight. What was the difference? And Mike, bless him, said, well, there's this little girl on my swim team and she interviewed me, and when my coach made me read the words back that I had told her about preparing for meets like this, and it got me into a positive frame of mind, and that was the difference. So I arrive on the pool deck the next day and Coach Rose says to me, Karen, did you see you're in the newspaper? So my dad goes out and buys every Long Beach Press-Telegram for miles. I feel like I should apologize to any swimmer who made the Olympic team the night before, because their parents were not going to be able to find any copies of their stories about them making the team. And sure enough, there was that quote from Mike. And I can't really impress upon you guys how shy I was at that age. I would have had trouble talking to anyone. I mean, that was why it was so tough for me to even imagine talking to Mike. So when I read those words and realized, like, me, the shy, timid kid, had written something that had made a positive impact on this person who I looked up to, I was just blown away. I remember saying to my dad, Dad, when I grow up, I want to do this. I want to tell people's stories and make a positive impact on their lives. So that's what happened. Mike went on to Montreal. He won the first gold medal for the United States, which earned him a phone call from President Ford. And then after the Olympics, he went back to Stanford. I went to high school. I completely lost track of him. Then years, decades later, I get the job at the New York Times, And I'd been there a few months, and I received this reader email. And it began, "You probably don't remember me, but you must be the Karen Crouse from Deanza Swim Club. This is Mike Brunner, and I just want you to know that every time I talk about my Olympic experience, I mention how it was your interview that gave me the right mental framework to make the team. So I always credit that interview I did with you for helping me make the Olympic team, and I'm so proud to see that you kept up with the journalism." So after I stopped crying and wiped my eyes, I emailed him back and said, "Remember you, I mean, for better or worse, you're why I'm doing what I'm doing now." And that was in 2006. And so for some reason, I had never really shared this story with very many people. And so before the 2012 Olympic swimming trials, I was talking to our Olympic editor, and I said, I was telling him why I love the Olympic trials so much. And I told this story. And he said, you should write this story. It would be, I think people would find it interesting. And especially in journalism right now, so many of my friends have lost their jobs, the business is contracting, and this was sort of a feel-good story to counter all of that bad news that just feels like an endless wave. So I did write this story, and after it ran, I received another reader email from a woman who had been my best friend in 8th grade, in 7th and 8th grade. And she said, "Karen, I read with great interest your story on Mike Brunner. I remember that Splash magazine because you were so proud of it and worked so hard on it. But I have to tell you, that was an extra credit assignment." And the idea that my whole life turned on an extra credit assignment is sort of mind-blowing. And I was the kind of student that the last thing I needed to do was an extra credit assignment. But I told my husband this. I read the email to him, and he was silent for a few seconds, and then he said, "Wow, that explains so much." So I guess the ancillary lesson to be taken from this, other than just show a generosity of spirit, 5 minutes of helping out a little nobody kid can change your life and theirs, is always go the extra mile. But for this reason, that began with Mike in 1976. The Olympics have always been super dear to me. I love them. I aspired to make an Olympic team. I never did. I never made a U.S. national team. I did not get a college scholarship. I was a walk-on at USC. And as I've gone through my professional career and had a chance to interview parents and coaches and kids, what I've seen in the last 30 years has been a bit disheartening, because it seems as if sports has become a bit of a zero-sum game where if you don't get that college scholarship, or you don't become a pro, or you don't make an Olympic team, you're seen as somehow a failure, that you did not succeed in what everybody's goal is, the carrot being dangled in front of everybody. And I've talked to parents who are positive that their 8-year-old or 9-year-old or 12-year-old is going to be the next Michael Phelps or Kobe Bryant, or just the next UConn women's basketball star. And it just feels as if I'm looking at them thinking, wow, so if they become the next Karen Crouse, does that mean that they're failures? And I feel as if a lot of what I got out of sports has been lost, that there are so many life lessons I took from my years in swimming: the delayed gratification, discipline, perseverance, resilience, being coachable, taking coaching, leadership, teamwork. I wouldn't trade those 12 years I swam for anything, for an Olympic gold medal or a world record or anything. And yet, it just seems as if the intrinsic benefits of sport are getting lost in this sort of what I call a youth sports industrialized complex. Not to mention all the friendships. Most of my friends to this day are people I met from the ages of 9 to 21 swimming. So this has all been sort of percolating in my mind. And then I was at the 2014 Olympics and I received this reader email saying, you know, this Hannah Carney, the mogul skier, you should really check out her hometown. She comes from a small town in Vermont that has produced a lot of Olympians. And so that intrigued me. I thought, wow, I looked up Norwich. I looked up Hannah's hometown, saw that it was Norwich, looked up Norwich, population 3,000. And sure enough, they had put 11 people on Olympic teams. So when I got back from those Olympics, I made my first ever trip to Vermont and just started talking to people. And what I found was so heartening, and it almost closed the circle back to Mike Brunner, because what I found were people who had that same generosity of spirit as Coach Rose and Mike Brunner. Townspeople who are willing to help other kids, not their own, in the town, whether it's financially, coaching, anything that they can do to help kids have a positive sports experience as children, whether it's paying their recreational league dues. This is a town that does not have any cuts. Everyone participates in the recreational leagues. There's a place for everyone. And I found that a lot of what I saw in the Olympic movement, all of the excesses, this just greed, corporate greed, you know, athletes feeling as if they can't be friends with their competitors because they're all chasing that same corporate dollar, that same corporate endorsement. I just didn't see that in Norwich. I saw a communitarian spirit that was so heartening. I saw people who were Olympians in 1984 continuing to coach in their sport and being as passionate about it as the teenagers they were coaching. And it reminded me so much of Santa Clara when I grew up there. So I undertook the book, and I realized pretty early on that what I had was almost a parenting guide masquerading as an Olympic book. That this was a place that looked at sports holistically, that it wasn't all about the end game, like what's the pot of gold at the end of this journey, but it was about the journey and about all of the intrinsic benefits. So the book came out right before the South Korea Olympics. So 2 weeks after the book came out, I went to Pyeongchang, and it was really, at first I thought, oh, this timing in a way is kind of crummy because I can't really be out promoting my book because I'm in South Korea covering all these events. And then what I realized is so much of what I was covering was almost affirming the messages in the book. You had Norway, which is the Norwich of countries, population, I wrote it down, 5.3 million people. So basically what I read was the population of Greater Detroit won 59 medals, 16 more medals than the United States. And they do it, and interestingly enough, one of my Norwich Olympians lives in Norway now. He married a Norway native and moved back to her homeland. And he coaches skiing there. And in conversations with him, he told me that in the winter sports especially, they do not post results, they do not publish results of any age group events. Not until you're 13 do they really start focusing in public on results. So you are not going to find any stories in Norway about the best 10-year-old alpine skier, because their approach is that they don't want the child's sports life to be from 7 to 17. They would rather those developing years be between 13 to 23 or 17 to 27. So their whole attitude is make sports as fun as it can be in the early stages, so that kids develop friendships, they develop technique, but they're not pressured about the end result. There's no sense of you're going to succeed or fail. They can just learn and develop without that pressure. And then if they are still interested in pursuing the sport when they're a teenager, it becomes more intense. One of my colleagues wrote a story from South Korea about the Norwegian alpine skiers who not only share rooms on the road, they share beds in some cases. It's just this instance of we're in it, one for all for one. And they find that they can be competitive, but that they can also lift one another up. They can be both competitors and almost collaborators, and that's exactly what I found in Norwich. The Norwich, they have this fun run, and I didn't know this, no one had told me this little tidbit at the time, or I would have included it in the book, but they have this turkey trot, this fun run every Thanksgiving. They actually do not put a starting line or finish line. They just let everyone start in a group, and whoever finishes. They go to that much trouble to not let you know it's about who gets off first and who finishes first. So I think when I was reading all of these stories about Norway, it really resonated with me because of Norwich. Also, you had so many of the U.S. athletes. I was so glad to see this, talking about how, I want to win a medal, but it's really not about the medals, because I think with the attention paid to the medal count and all of the television coverage, which tends to be focused on the medal winners, it gets lost that it's really very cool to even participate in this world event. And you had Lindsey Vonn, who won a bronze medal, talking about how that bronze medal was as meaningful to her as the gold that she had won in 2010. You had Michaela Schifrin, who had gone into this Olympics with an outside shot at 3 to 5 gold medals, walking away with a gold and a silver, and saying afterward, it's not necessarily only the medalists who get the most out of the Olympics. It's those who are willing to strip down to nothing and bare their soul for their love of the game. That is so much greater than gold, silver, or bronze. And in that message, I heard echoes of every Norwich Olympian with whom I spoke. Norwich has 3 Olympic medals total, 2 by Hannah Carney. She won a gold medal in 2010 and a bronze in defense of that gold medal in 2014. And then in 1960, Betsy Snipe, the older sister of Sonny, who was the one who had accompanied me here a couple years ago, she won an alpine skiing medal. So for a lot of the athletes in Norwich, it is about the purity of purpose, the passion, the taking part in this great event, the self-direction, self-goals, self-improvement. And Michaela's words really reminded me of what I heard time and again there. And then there was Adam Rippon, who I did a lot of figure skating in the first week. And he was on the red carpet last night at the Academy Awards. Here's a guy who finished 10th in men's figure skating. He won a team bronze, but he seemed to have the most fun Olympics of anyone. And I loved his attitude, because he said, he knew that his chances of medaling in the men's figure skating were slim to none. He just doesn't have the quad jumps. Everyone else was doing quads. He had no quads in his program. But he said, you know what my goal is? My goal is to come here and skate 3 clean programs. My program in the team event, my short program, and my long program. That is my goal. I want to skate 3 clean programs. And he did. And the emotion that poured out of him when he finished his long program, knowing that he had nailed it and had achieved his goal, was as inspiring as any, gold medal moment I saw at those games. And I felt like watching him as this week proceeded, that he really got it, that this is just about going there and soaking in the atmosphere and making friends with people in other sports and being the best that you can be. It's not about, do you win a medal? Are you a winner, or are you the first loser, as an ad campaign that in 1996 stated of silver medalists, the first losers. And then that brings me to Esther Ledecky. I had the pleasure and privilege of covering her second gold medal. So does Esther Ledecky, that name, ring a bell to anyone here? Okay, so she is from the Czech Republic, and she is an alpine skier and a snowboarder, which, 2 separate sports, really. They don't even share the same mountain. So she had been doing both these sports since the age of 7, and had been told since the age of 7, you cannot do both these sports. You have to pick one or the other. And she said, no way, I can't pick. I enjoy both equally. So she said that whenever a coach told her she couldn't do both, she just found another coach. And again, I could hear echoes of Norwich. All of the Olympians, except for the first, Betsy Snight, were multi-sport athletes in high school. Felix McGrath, who moved to Norway, the alpine skier, he was actually a 4-sport athlete. So they very much were simpatico with Esther and their thinking. And so even last fall, her snowboarding coach, her best results had been in snowboarding. She won the World Cup. So she was going to come into these Olympics as the favorite in the parallel snowboarding, but she was not considered a medal favorite at all in the alpine races. So her snowboarding coach took her aside and said, I'm a little worried that if you do this Super G, and I think she was also planning to do the slalom until the schedule changed because of the weather, I'm worried it might prevent you from winning the gold medal in snowboarding. So I'm thinking maybe just for the Olympics you should concentrate on snowboarding. And she said to him what she had said to every coach since day one. I want to do both. I enjoy both. And yeah, I want to win medals, but it's more important to me to have fun. And I will have more fun if I do both events. And so she, stunned is, probably a mild way of putting it, the field in the Super G. I guess the NBC announcers thought, after a certain point, no one was going to beat the Austrian who was in the lead and switched to figure skating, and down comes Esther, I think the 26th skater or 26th starter, and wins by 1/100th of a second. So I just thought it was so great to see a woman win 2 gold medals in 2 different sports and say afterward, well, yeah, it's great that I won the gold medals, but that wasn't really my goal. I just love doing both. I have so much fun doing both, and that's why I do it. And I went to a press conference that Michaela and Lindsay gave just to ask them about Esther. And Lindsay said, hey, more power to her. I tried snowboarding once and it ended very badly. And she said, I also tried when I was younger gymnastics, figure skating, volleyball. I just wasn't really that good in anything, so that's why I gravitated towards skiing. And Michaela, who has really shown great versatility in the technical events and the speed events and alpine skiing, said, you know, if I was a little kid, I might look at what Esther did here and say, yeah, I want to do that too. So I took that as a positive sign that, you know, there is maybe a movement underfoot, that a lot of the principles that I found in Norwich can be replicated elsewhere in the United States and abroad, and we don't all have to move to Norwich, and they would really prefer that we all not move to Norwich to have this value system. So that's a short kind of summary of my Olympics and why I love it so and how I came to write the book. And I'm going to open it to questions. I can talk more about my job and what I do, but I'd rather see what you would like me to address.
Yeah, so if you want to just ask a question, just raise your hand and Karen will call on you. I know you sent me questions, I can prompt you, but why don't you jump in?
First question is always the hardest. Yes?
So in one of the excerpts from your book that I was reading in the New York Times, you mentioned that some of your colleagues, and even yourself to a degree, had experienced like a level of like fatigue with the Olympics and were getting a little in the process. Did preparing for Norwich or even going to South Korea, did that like revitalize it as you expected?
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. It renewed my faith in the Olympics, and again, I told the stories that I did so that you guys would understand how important the Olympics, what a huge role the Olympics has played in my growth and development in life. And so sitting in Sochi, it was especially disheartening because we were in this town where we looked, one day it was actually warmer in Sochi than it was in West Palm Beach, Florida. So here we are at a Winter Olympics that was completely manufactured. All of the facilities had been created just for this one event. The snow was man-made. Thousands of people had been displaced from their homes to make way for these facilities that you could tell were quickly going to become white elephants. All of the reasons that I fell in love with the Olympics seemed to be missing. This just seemed to be this enterprise of greed. You know, Vladimir Putin was holding these games as sort of worldwide propaganda for his system. Not long after the last visitor left, he declared war on his neighbors. So it just felt as if all of the Olympic ideals that I held so dear, that this could be an event that brings together people from all over the world, that you can understand one another better, that everyone is just trying to do their best and be the best that they can be, and it didn't matter if you were the best or not necessarily. All of that had been lost. You know, you had a lot of athletes now get so hyped in the months and years leading to the Olympics that you can see the pressure on their faces that to perform. And I think Michaela even addressed that she went into the Olympics 4 years ago and didn't feel near the pressure that she felt this time. And weirdly, she should have felt less pressure because her resume was so much deeper this year than it had been 4 years ago. So what was the difference? The difference was just all of this hype that she had been declared she was going to be the it girl of this Olympics. And so there were just a lot of people hyping that she was going to win 2, 3, 5 gold medals. And that can quickly take you out of the process. That she's very process oriented. She enjoys the process. She enjoys the journey. And now all of a sudden people are making it about the end result. And I had seen the trickle-down effect even in youth sports when I had gone to swim meets and seen 11 and 12-year-olds who are just training, crazy hours a week and getting extra coaching on the side and living away from home so they can train with the best coaches. And it just feels like, what's the end game? If you put a bunch of parents in a room like this of young kids and you say, how many of you think your child is going to get a college scholarship? Every parent will raise his or her hand, and that's wonderful that they have that belief in their child, but the statistics bear them out. We'll tell a different story. 2% of kids that participate in high school sports will get a college scholarship. Of that number, the number who will go on to be in an Olympics or a pro athlete, it's well under 1%. So it's, infinitesimal, and yet you have these parents who are acting as if this is the carrot that is, being dangled in front of their children, and giving their children the belief or the feeling, subtle or not, that, well, this is totally doable, and if you don't do it, well, then you've failed. And that just is almost putting your child in an impossible position. And I think that's why we see so many kids burn out at 13, 14, 15. I remember I got to college in 1980 when it was just the first wave of scholarships being given to women. And some of my teammates who were recipients of these scholarships at USC, they were frankly exhausted. They got to college and went wild. It was like, I got my college scholarship, now mom and dad, leave me alone. I'm gonna have fun. And so they had a lot of fun. They swam really horribly, but it was just like their lives had been so scheduled and structured toward this one goal that when they reached it, it was like, okay, leave me alone. I want to have fun now. And so I really think there's a message to be imparted that you can have both. It's not an either or proposition where you either go down this Olympic path or you have fun, but the two cannot meet. I think Norwich has shown that you can have a healthy path where you can enjoy what you do, you can reach the summit of your sport, but it just requires a different way of looking at what is important in the sport, a shift in your value system away from the end result and more toward the process. And I mean, it sounds almost trite, right? It's the journey, not the end. It's the process, not the result. But it's really true. I think that's what I noticed about the Norwich Olympians that was really heartening to me is they all seem to be able to make the transition from their sport to their next act. And that may sound simple, but it's very difficult. And the more success you have as an athlete, the harder that transition seems to be, because you are so wholly invested, your identity is so wholly invested in the sport. I am a swimmer, therefore I am. I am a hurdler, therefore I am. And so then when you no longer have that sport, it's like, well, if I'm not an athlete, who or what am I? The kids in Norwich didn't have that problem for the most part, because they were never just seen as athletes. They were seen as neighbor kids, as members of the community. They were very involved in the community. The community was involved in their lives too. So they always knew that they were students and they were athletes and they were neighbors. And so they had a social safety net that really helped them when they got through with their sport. I did a story last September talking to Michael Phelps, and he was telling me about his anxiety and depression that at times left him suicidal. And this is after his 8 gold medal performance in Beijing. So this is after he's reached the pinnacle of not only his sport, but sport, that he's starting to have all of these mental health issues. And what he's done now, and I would argue it may end up being more important than those 28 medals he won, is he has become an advocate for speaking out about mental health, helping people who have mental health issues, who suffer from anxiety and depression. He has become almost an unofficial therapist to other athletic stars. He has counseled Tiger Woods after Tiger's DUI for misuse of prescription pain medicine. He has counseled Grant Hackett, who is one of the most famous swimmers to come out of Australia. And if you know about swimming in Australia, they're treated like NFL stars here or NBA stars here. He would be the equivalent of Tom Brady. So Michael told me in this piece that he talked to a 9 or 10-year-old boy who came up to him and said, you know, I've thought about killing myself, but knowing that you've gone through it is really helping me to hang in there. And imagine being 9 or 10 and having these feelings, and then imagine being able to talk about it with someone who is perhaps, well, is for sure the greatest athlete in the sport in which you are participating. This boy was a swimmer. So powerful. And I think piggybacking on Mike's introduction, when I was at USC, I saw so many. I trained with Olympic gold medalists and world record holders. I was around athletes in the training room who would go on to Hall of Fame careers in football and baseball. And what I saw is there seems to be this myth making that if you are one of these athletes, you live a charmed life and you have no problems, you know, you are just living the fairy tale. And what I saw up close when I was in college was that this was so far from the truth, and that many of the best athletes were dealing with really deep, profound issues, whether it's depression or anxiety, substance abuse. And I think they bought into the fairy tale themselves, like, oh, if I can just win a gold medal or set a world record or get drafted into the NFL, all of my problems will go away. And of course they didn't. In fact, for a lot of them, it just created more problems. But what I saw among my peers in college is that they weren't really free to talk about how their lives were not perfect, because everyone who talked to them for stories, that was their narrative. Oh, you're living the fairy tale. So then the fairy tale became just another anxiety for them, something they felt they had to perpetuate. And so it just created more stress and more pressure. And I remember vowing, boy, if I get out and can become a journalist, I'm going to try to tell people's stories honestly so that they don't feel like they're stuck in this box of perfection where they have to live a lie in essence and act as if everything is perfect when it really is not. That they, like the rest of us, are all perfectly imperfect. And to me, that's what makes them more relatable, makes their stories more interesting, because you may not be able to relate to someone winning 28 medals, but you surely can relate to maybe being bullied as a teenager or feeling depression or anxiety. To me, that makes Michael Phelps way more endearing and relatable than his Olympic success. And so at every level of sport that I've covered, I've really tried to humanize the people I write about. And so you can see that while they're very good at what they do, their lives are by no means perfect, and that's crazy to even expect that of anyone's life. Yes?
So I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts on, I know you've covered like 10 Olympics, and it's kind of a two-part question. The first one is kind of relating to when you're in that kind of like host venue or that Olympic kind of country, whoever's hosting it, how do you think they do well to allow the press and media to kind of be able to tell those stories?
Right.
And what like the positives and negatives? And the second part is like, what do you do to kind of immerse yourself in the culture of that country to help you write those stories?
Well, that's the main problem about an Olympics, is it occurs in a bubble. You're in this bubble for 19 days, and it's very hard to immerse yourself in culture because you are in the bubble of covering events. For me, the Summer Olympics is especially difficult. I never pulled an all-nighter through school. Never did in high school, never did in college. Every Olympics, I pull at least one all-nighter, and especially in the Summer Olympics because swimming takes place in the morning and at night, and so you're always writing things. And during Michael's career, there was so much interest in him that I would be doing podcasts for our website or be narrating doing audio for some video or writing stories. It was just feeding this, beast, this 24/7 news cycle. So it becomes extremely difficult to eat or sleep, much less immerse yourself in the culture. So I am perfectly honest in telling you I immersed myself very little in South Korean culture. It just, the pace is so maniacal, and it was easier in London. At the 2012 Summer Games, all of the media, we stayed in existing hotels in the city, so you really felt as if you were just part of the fabric of the city. And I had my little coffee place I would go every day, and I would see the same people every day, and by the end of the fortnight, the barista knew what my order was, and I could talk to people on the sidewalk as I was walking to buses and whatnot. But most of the time it's like it was in South Korea, where we have a media village where we're all sequestered and we get on one bus to another bus to another bus. And the only time you're really mixing with the locals is if they are attending, they're spectating at the events, and you can go up and talk to them. So it's very difficult. I remember early in the Olympics, I went to do an interview with Katie Couric, and she was staying at a hotel that was never going to be confused with the media village. So I took a cab to her hotel, and the view from the hotel was just all ocean. It was just panoramic ocean. And I sat in her lobby for an hour just drinking up the scene and going, oh, right, I'm in a coastal city. I had never seen the water from where I was staying, because when you are in this village, this media village, you honestly go out, you catch a bus to whatever event you're covering, you get off the bus, you go through security, you're in the bubble, and that's your life. It kind of reminds me, I'm not as bad as this, but at the 2008 Olympics, I at least saw the Great Wall when I was in Beijing. I did make time for that. But the water cube where the swimming was held, it would light up at night and it would change colors. It was this really beautiful light show that you would see. And so I remember afterward asking Michael Phelps about it, like, wasn't it cool about how the water cube lit up at night? And he looked at me with this perfectly blank face and said, it did? He was so focused on his task at hand, he did not even notice that the water cube was lighting up. And I think for most of us covering the Olympics, sadly, that's our experience. We're so focused on the task at hand that we don't have that immersion experience. Now, I had a few colleagues there because we had a small army covering this event where that was their assignment, to go out every day and immerse themselves in some aspect of the culture and then report on it. But while they were doing that, I was at figure skating or short track speed skating or up at the snowboarding event. So it's difficult. And then what was your other?
How does the Olympic venue, how do they help to kind of get you access, whether it be facilities or policies, to get you in front of players and coaches?
It's so interesting. I love the Olympics because it gives you a window into how the relationship athletes from other countries have with their journalists. And I had seen, you see this also in tennis too. But it's very funny because for the most part in the United States, you have this mixed zone that all the athletes have to go through after their event. And the Americans, they come through and it's very formal. Okay, you have 3 questions, and so you'll get to ask 3 questions and then they're gone. And a lot of the other countries I've noticed, they'll come over to the journalists, give them a hug, exchange the kisses, spend 10, 15 minutes talking. It's just a completely different atmosphere and vibe. And I think part of that is, for some of these countries, they only may have 5, 10, 15 Olympians, so they develop a much closer relationship with them. It's maybe not as adversarial. And there's always a point in that mixed zone where we're looking over at the United States reporters are looking over at one of these scenes where the athlete's going on for minutes and minutes, and it seems like so much is being communicated, and we think, wouldn't that be nice? But it's just the nature of the beast. I think also after Esther Ledecky won the parallel snowboarding event, we stood in the mixed zone for 2 hours before we got her. The U.S. press, there were maybe 6 of us. We were the last people to get her. So she went through at least an hour and 15 minutes of that was TV from all over the world and radio, and then just different print outlets. So imagine, sitting out. It started as a fairly warm afternoon, and by the end of standing there, my feet were frozen, just waiting and waiting and waiting. And then when we got her, it was like 4 questions. So the Olympics is, I think, the access that you see if you're watching it on TV, NBC, because it's a rights holder, gets the most access. So the access they're getting, that you're seeing, their interviews and stuff, is not what the rest of us are getting. And what I have found from covering all of these Olympics is that preparation, it's almost like being an Olympic athlete, being an Olympic reporter. The preparation is of the utmost importance. You have got to talk to everyone that you need to talk to by 6 months out before the Olympics, because that's when everyone starts shutting down access. People start getting nervous, so they're less likely to just talk to you openly and in a relaxed fashion. I know I can give you an example from Rio. So I went to the World Championships in Russia in the year before, in 2015, and realized that this Hungarian swimmer was going to be a big story in Rio. She had improved a lot, in her events, was challenging world records, but beyond that, her coach was her husband, and they had a very, to some people, troubling relationship where he appeared to some people to be almost abusive. So I realized, wow, this is going to be a big story, I think. So I did all the reporting for that a year out, and then we ran the story right before the Olympics started. Michael Phelps, I went up to Colorado Springs, as it turned out, like days before Boomer was born, and spent a couple days with him there to do my big Michael Phelps story. So that's how you almost have to approach it, because if you haven't developed a relationship with these people before you get to the Olympics, it's going to be very difficult. Before this Olympics, I went to the U.S. Figure Skating Championships. I also went to a Skate America in Lake Placid, and this story I had done in Rio on the Hungarian swimmer Katinka Hasu, it ended up being a huge story for us. It blew up because what happened is she won the 400 IM on the opening day. She broke a world record that many people thought might never be broken because it was set by a Chinese woman who people believed to have been using performance-enhancing drugs. So it felt like a record that was out of reach. She shattered it. And then, you know, her husband went crazy on the sidelines. NBC was zeroing in on the husband. The commentators just started basically regurgitating stuff that had been in my story. So this woman won multiple medals, and every time she won a medal, my story got a news push, and you know, more people were clicking on the story. So my sports editor back in the fall of last year said, okay, so your challenge is to find the Katinka story of this Olympics, the story that everybody else is going to be chasing. And I'm thinking, oh, great, we're only a few months out, that ship has sailed, you know, it's too late now. But I did have one idea, and it sprang from, this was right after Gracie Gold, who was considered one of our best hopes for a medal in women's figure skating. She essentially took herself out of the running for an Olympic berth by taking herself out of competition and announcing that she was getting treatment for an eating disorder. And I thought, okay, that story has been told from the female perspective, but what about the men in figure skating? Don't they face the same rigid judging? And I wonder if they're dealing with a lot of eating disorders. And I just know from having covered different sports over the years that it is not a single gender issue, that there are men who deal with regimented eating and restricted eating and eating disorders. So I decided, you know, I'm curious, so I'm going to look into that. So I went to the Skate America event at Lake Placid, and Adam Rippon was there competing. And he was so, I don't know if his personality comes across the TV when you're watching telecast, but he's just so outgoing and gregarious and personable. And I thought, you know, if anyone is going to talk to me about this, it's going to be this guy. I had never even heard of him before. So I introduced myself to him, and I said, you know, Adam, you do not have the stereotypical figure skating body. I mean, you almost look like you're built more like a speed skater. Has that been at all a problem for you over the years? And he said, oh, honey, let me tell you, because there was a long time where I did not like my body at all. In fact, there were many years where I got by on 3 pieces of bread with, I can't believe it's not butter spread, until I finally realized that I needed to learn to love the body that I have. And I said, Adam, when was that you learned to love the body that you have? And he looked at me and he said, last year. And I said, I need to talk to you more about this. And so I did. So I used him as the anchor for this reporting. And then it was really interesting. I talked to over a dozen male skaters from all different countries. And they all, except for Adam, would say, well, yeah, I have very good friends in the sport who have eating disorders, and it's really awful to watch. And they all knew somebody, but they wouldn't give particulars, like, well, who should I talk to then? Oh, I don't want to say who it is. But none of them had a personal story. None of them at least had one they wanted to share. I mean, there's a real stigma and shame to it, unfortunately. So it was why I was so happy that Adam was willing to open up about it. So what I found myself having to do is go back to skaters who are recently retired or not so recently retired, because they were more open about talking about it. So we ran the story right before the men's figure skating, and I'm sure it didn't hurt that between the time I did the reporting and when the story ran, Adam had become sort of the early darling of the Olympics. And so people were looking for stories about him. So here's this very serious story with him as an anchor. And we ran it on the front page of the newspaper, and it got like just amazing attention and feedback. So right after it ran, my sports editor sent me, a couple days later, sent me an email saying, I can't believe that I challenged you to find the story of these Olympics, and you did. So earned my paycheck, fooled them again. But you know, it's just, I think a lot of reporting is just, you look at news and you think, I try to take news that is timely and relevant and try to look at it from a fresh angle or a different prism. I really pride myself on trying to tell stories that other people have not told. Even if I were to be assigned a LeBron James story tomorrow, with all of the thousands of stories that have been written on him, I would make it my goal to try to write a story that would tell you something you didn't already know about him. That's sort of where I put my, you know, latent competitiveness from swimming into the journalism world. And so I feel like if this topic or person is interesting to me, it most likely will be interesting to our readers too. Yes.
Sure, I'll ask this exactly. Do you think this sort of zero-sum culture in the Olympics, do you think it's do you think it might have been created by this sort of chase for scholarships and sponsorships, and do you think this forces athletes to push themselves beyond what would be deemed healthy?
Absolutely. Really good question. Thank you for that. When I was trying to figure this out, because in the 30 years that I've been out in the real world covering athletes, it seems like it has gotten worse, that the zero-sum game, that the definition of success has gotten narrower and narrower and narrower. And if you look at the arc of sports in our country in those 30 years, it's all about the availability of scholarships. That there are so many more scholarships, especially for women, available now than in my day, like exponentially more. And so my parents, when I began swimming, never thought, oh, well, we can get Karen's education paid by swimming, because that just wasn't available when I started out. Now, by the time I got into college, it was, but there were schools that I might have gone to that were immediately out I immediately took out of consideration because they didn't have women's swim teams. So I really was on that first cusp of college scholarships. And now I talk to coaches who say, oh, yeah, like it's all about the college scholarship, and I think that's what's creating a lot of the anxiety and depression, is that even those kids who are fortunate enough to reach that goal, to get that carrot, the price they pay is so great that they have not led well-rounded childhoods, they haven't had balanced childhoods, they haven't been encouraged to develop as people, they've only been encouraged to develop as athletes. So their self-identities are so narrow and so fragile that when they have any kind of adversity, it really is hard for them to bounce back from. And I've had many discussions about this. One of my good friends from college, I swam with her at USC. She was a member of this, she made the 1976 Canadian Olympic team at 13. And she became a psychologist and now works as a psychologist to athletes at USC. And she tells me about, in general, what the things she's dealing with. And these teenagers are dealing with really profound issues. And so I've asked her, like, what's the difference? I mean, we never saw this when we were their age. Like, were people going through this in silence? Were they just dropping out and we never heard from them again? And she said, well, there was some of that, but the pressure on these kids is so much more. You can't believe it. Like, a lot of these kids get to college and the scholarship was their parents' dream. And so they were going along with it because they wanted to please their parents, or they wanted to please a coach, or so they get the scholarship and then they get into college and realize, you know, I'm kind of tired of this sport, but I have to keep doing it because I have to please my parents. This is what makes them happy. They're so proud of me. And notice that in all of this, the person is not discussed at all. Like, well, shouldn't they be pleased that you're a person that got into this college and that you're studying to get a degree and that your world is expanding and that you've left the nest and are becoming independent? And it's strange. I even told this friend of mine, I said, the weird thing is, I felt like I was way more resilient for having been an athlete, because believe me, for every one little success I had 100 failures. And so it taught me resilience. And yet now these kids, it's almost like they feel like they can't fail. They don't realize that failure is a necessary part of succeeding. It's a necessary rung on the ladder to success. You can't succeed until you fail. It takes all these failures to learn how to succeed. And so I can see why there's so much anxiety and depression, because if you feel like this natural part of growth and development is not allowable, that's extremely stressful. I remember when I talked with Michael and Grant, it was so sobering because they said to me, so Michael made his first Olympic team at 15 and Grant became an international star around the same age. And they said to me, imagine from the time we were 15, we were never able to make a first impression on someone because everyone we met already either thought they knew us or thought they knew everything about us. So imagine that gift that you and I have of just being able to go and meet someone and they either like us or don't like us based on that first impression or our own personalities or our interests or whatnot. People like Michael and Grant who achieve this athletic success or any kind of success, I'm sure this holds true in acting, music as well, people they can't be known ever as themselves. They don't even know who they are really, because everyone relates to them as the athlete and thinks they know their story and their background. You know, they told the story of having all these people go, "Hey, Michael," and they're thinking like, do I know that person? But that person feels as if they know Michael. And then they also said another piece of it, and again, this is like developmental 101 for adolescents. They never had to learn how to reach out and make friends or make social contact or small talk. Things that the rest of us have to learn, or else we would feel very isolated and lonely, right? Because people were always coming up to them and making the overture, making the first move. So that's a really huge part of developing as a person that they never had to develop, because people were just always coming up to them and making the first move. So they all they had to do was react and sign an autograph or pose for a selfie. So it really stunts their development as people. You can see where they learn to see themselves only as this one-dimensional, almost cardboard cutout figure of, I am the champion athlete.
We are about out of time. I guess we have time for another quick question, and then Karen, the bookstore actually brought some of Karen's books. If someone wanted to buy them, she would sign them in the lobby, but also just answer your questions regardless.
And I can stay after too if you guys
Yeah, so one more question.
Yes.
What would be a word of advice for someone looking into a career journalism that
For-
would be obvious?
Career for journalism?
Yes.
Well, write and read, you know, read, and when you're not reading, write. And, you know, work for the paper here, work for whatever media outlet that is interesting to you that's here in the college. Volunteer. You know, I had a person that asked me that question, ended up volunteering to do play-by-play for the University of Denver women's basketball team. So just put yourself out there just to get the experience. You're not only serving a valuable service by doing that work, but you're also figuring out, is this something I really enjoy doing? Some of these jobs look quite glamorous until you're there on a Friday or Saturday night and all your friends are out partying and you're stuck covering some event that doesn't all of a sudden seem so interesting to you. So it's really good to just volunteer to do as much as you can and see what you like and don't like.
Karen Crouse, thank you very much.